everybody. My name is Jamie Boulding. I'm an assistant professor of theology and science at Seton University here in New Jersey, and I also work with the Witherspoon Institute here in Princeton. So our topic for this panel is, are we friends or enemies? So thinking about how we stand in relation to each other. Should we understand ourselves in terms of victims and oppressors, or in a different kind of way in terms of friends, colleagues, collaborators? How should we think through questions about justice, oppression, forgiveness, and mercy? So these are all very important questions in the context of DEI. They're also very important questions that were raised just in the last couple of days by Pope Francis's new encyclical, his fourth encyclical, which was published just 2 days ago, titled He Loved Us. And the whole topic of that encyclical is human and divine love, which of course is closely related to human and divine friendship. And indeed, the concept of friendship is referenced dozens of times in that encyclical. So the Catholic tradition, as well as other theological traditions that are represented on this panel, and of course in the conference more broadly, have important things to say on this question of friendship, relationship, and love. And so I think the question before us is, how can we draw on these theological resources and traditions and insights to bring some value and to bring some new ways of thinking, new directions maybe, to the conversation on DEI? So to help guide us through some of these questions this morning, we're joined by three excellent panelists. So starting from closest to me, heading down the line, we have Professor Joshua Hochschild, who is a professor of philosophy at Mount St. Mary's University in Maryland. We have Jeff Liou, who is the National Director of Theological Formation for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, USA. And we have Professor George Yancey, who is a sociology professor at Baylor University. So as Brandon mentioned, the format of this panel will follow yesterday's panels. I'll invite each of our panelists to begin with an opening statement, around 15 minutes or so, opening statements, and then we'll open things up for questions from me, and I hope a good number of questions from the audience as well. So with all of that, I'd like to invite Professor Hochschild to begin things for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Is this working okay? As Jamie mentioned, the topic of our panel is, are we friends or enemies? I'm not going to address friendship and enemyhood directly, but it's implicit in what I'm going to say in two ways. First of all, I do think that underlying some of the questions that we've discussed already about DEI is whether when we are considering these social challenges, whether the sort of fundamental assumption is that people are in an agonistic relationship fighting with each other as enemies, or whether the presumption is that they're friends and whatever their differences are, they're seeking something in common. I think that framing is really important. Also in the background of all of our conversations is the question of whether a Christian theological tradition or other religious theological traditions can be friends with the phenomenon that has emerged as a DEI industry, as a structure in society that is advocating views, and how friendly the Christian tradition can be with that. So that both of those will be in the background for my remarks. Also, as Jamie mentioned, Francis did publish an encyclical 2 days ago, and I want to read two passages from that encyclical that help me to frame my remarks. In paragraph 88, Francis warns against being excessively caught up in external activities, structural reforms, obsessive reorganization plans, worldly projects, secular ways of thinking, and mandatory programs, all of which, he says, deprive us of the personal experience of friendship with Christ. So Francis is reflecting on how a certain kind of obsession with social activity and organization and structure can distract the Christian from the more interior and personal encounter with Jesus Christ. in other people and in ourselves. About 100 paragraphs later, 183, Francis also warns against the social consequences of sin. And he exhorts us as Christians to expose and resist alienated social structures. He even cites John Paul II on structures of sin in this paragraph. And to support efforts within society to restore and consolidate the common good. I think juxtaposing these two passages captures a kind of tension or challenge that Christians have always faced, right, between the idea that the moral responsibility of a Christian is something interior and the matter of an individual will, and that we shouldn't be distracted by the busyness of the exterior life, but also the recognition that someone who is and is trying to be transformed by an encounter with Christ, that is going to change their relationship to the outer world and help them to see flaws and problems with society that need to be addressed. I approach this question as a philosopher, this tension as a philosopher, and especially as someone who is interested in always engaging St. Thomas Aquinas as a resource for the Catholic intellectual tradition. I teach at a college, undergraduates. I also teach seminary students, and I write and research about Aquinas. But if I look back at the kinds of things that I've ended up doing without even planning it, right, I'm rarely simply doing historical research about what Aquinas happened to say in this or that text. For me, what's exciting is to notice how Aquinas offers resources for us to continually renew the Catholic intellectual tradition and address issues that maybe he didn't address, questions that he never would have asked. Maybe he can answer those questions, maybe he can reframe those questions. So what I'm going to talk about today is the possibility of Aquinas being a resource for three concepts that many Catholics tend to think are antithetical to the Catholic intellectual tradition, concepts that are sometimes associated with a secular or with a Marxist or socialist approach to the social life, concepts that are not named as such in St. Thomas. So if you were simply asking the exegetical question, right, can you find these in the Summa Theologiae? You can't. But I think if we reflect on what problems society is struggling with and how they're trying to name them, and then look to Aquinas for the way that he would try to frame the moral life and the social life, that we can find some resources for that. By the way, one way to do that, right, is to take concepts that are common, like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and reflect on what a Christian or a Catholic or a Thomistic meaning of those might be. Another way to do that is to reflect on what alternatives to those might be. So for instance, there was discussion yesterday about maybe the proper way to discuss these isn't diversity, equity, and inclusion, but say dignity, equality, and solidarity, right? DES instead of DEI. I'm not going to talk about any of those three terms. We had three panels yesterday, a diversity panel, an equity panel, and an inclusion panel. I'm going to talk about the following three ideas, and just very briefly suggest why it is that some Catholics, at least, are resistant to these ideas, but then find a kind of Thomistic way into these ideas that we could engage them. The first one is the idea of structural evil or systemic evil. And you can understand why, from a certain perspective, this would sound like it is contrary to a traditional Catholic approach to the moral life, right? What is the locus of moral value, moral judgment in the moral life? It's the individual agent, right? Where sin is in the person, right? So when you're talking about sin, you always have to talk about a moral agent who's making decisions, and we can classify moral actions based on the individual will of the agent. So you do sometimes hear people say, look, sin isn't in a structure, sin is in individual human beings. My response to that would be, well, yes, sin is in individual human beings, but human beings are social animals, and we are formed by social patterns of organization, and we ourselves participate in perpetuating social patterns of organization. So a sinful human being can be having effects on a social structure that degrade that social structure. And social structures that are themselves imperfectly formed can ill-form a human agent so that they are incapable of forming the habits that they need to be as virtuous as they should be. So I don't think it's contrary to a Catholic or even a specifically Thomistic approach to ethics and moral theory to suggest that there are structural evils or social evils. Evil, metaphysically, isn't a thing anyway, right? It's a privation. It's something missing a perfection that it could have. The moral agent is the primary locus of the evil that we call sin. But insofar as social structures are realities too, Aristotle would say not substances, but they're accidental unities, and they are real, right? Accidents aren't somehow false or illusory, they are real, and they form us, and it's natural for us as human beings to participate in social structures. They can fail to be realized in the way that they should be, and they could be systemically or systematically broken or wounded in a way that needs to be addressed. So that would seem to be something that should interest a moral agent who is affected by those institutions or who seeks to continue participating in those institutions or find alternatives to them. So that's the first notion that you will sometimes see people have an almost allergic reaction to. Oh no, sin or evil is not a social entity. It's not out there. It's only in the human heart. Well, it's in the human heart, but all of our hearts are connected, and our hearts are connected through social interactions, and so it can be out there in systems and in structures. Another concept that, again, if you looked it up in the Summa Theologiae, I don't think you would find it as such. And it sometimes seems as if it's associated with a secular or socialist or Marxist view of human relationships, is the idea of collective responsibility or collective guilt, or I think I would rather call it corporate guilt. Right? Can a group be responsible for something? There's a kind of obvious sense in which we want to say no, right? If a group is responsible for something, if we're tempted to say that a group is responsible for something, what we really mean is that some member of that group who is maybe acting on behalf of that group as the agent of that group is responsible for something. But again, the agency, the responsibility, and the culpability, if there's something wrong, is always in the individual agent. I think that's the temptation that we would typically fall back on. But I don't think that's exactly right. I think that sometimes we do want to say that there is a responsibility in the group, in the corporate body, and that it doesn't reside or remain only in whatever agents were acting on behalf of that group, right? If you're suing a corporation because they've failed you in some way, they can't get out of the lawsuit by firing the CEO who was in charge of the corporation when they committed the action, right? The corporation, just as a matter of law, right, has an agency independent of the particular people that make it up. We also, I think, can feel like we inherit or take on responsibility for actions that other people commit, right? As a father, if one of my children damages the neighbor's property, right? And the neighbor comes and wants to talk to me about it. I can't just say, well, talk to my kid, right? I might have to own that, right? It will be on me. If my parents die with some obligation to fulfill, some debts might be discharged upon death, but others I might actually inherit. And we don't think that's strange at all. Right? I can be responsible for something that I didn't do, but that it comes to me because of a status I have in relationship to other people. In the theological tradition, I think the most obvious example of corporate responsibility, culpability, corporate guilt is the doctrine of original sin. And we all as Christians are called to own our own participation in something that we had nothing to do with, in a sense, right? Great-great-great-great-grandparents who made some mistake with the fruit in the garden. From a certain perspective, that actually sounds quite ridiculous. And historically, Christians have had to sort of admit, yeah, the doctrine of original sin, that is a pretty strange doctrine. But on the other hand, it does seem to be a key to understanding our condition and status as human beings in the state that we're in, that we participate in a body, the whole human race, that has inherited a status, even if no one of us is individually responsible for creating that condition. The last concept or phrase that I want to talk about is the notion of social justice. You will often see people say social justice is a secular concept. Justice is a personal virtue. There might be other language for distinguishing kinds of justice in the tradition, but social justice is not a concern of the Christian or even the Aristotelian tradition of reflecting on justice. Someone mentioned a Jordan Peterson tweet complaining about Pope Francis yesterday. There's another Jordan Peterson tweet complaining about Pope Francis talking about social justice and saying there's no such thing as social justice. I've long thought that Jordan Peterson was on the way to becoming a Catholic. And if he ever does become a Catholic, he'll probably stop being so authoritative about what Catholics do or don't believe. But before being a Catholic, he's very confident about what Catholics do or don't believe. I think it was Sebastian yesterday who briefly mentioned the origin of the notion of social justice. It is originally a Catholic term. It was coined in the middle of the 19th century. It's usually traced to an Italian scholar of natural law named Luigi Tapparelli. His great work has never been entirely translated into English, but there's a lot of scholarship about Tapparelli and the idea of social justice. Tapparelli was looking around and noticing that the Catholic theological tradition needed to develop a new vocabulary to address the complexity of social organization and to absorb the new insights of social sciences that were tending to sort of go off on their own apart from philosophy and theology. So he really was trying to conceive of a kind of Catholic social science that would encompass the new conditions of post-industrial modernity. The term, didn't necessarily acquire a clear technical meaning for a long time, but it was used through the end of the 19th century. It was used in the encyclical of Pius XI, Quadragesimo Anno, in 1931. And some people say that it didn't get its formal definition until Pius's 1937 Divini Redemptoris. If you go and look that up, Divini Redemptoris, paragraphs 50 to 55 contain the kind of classic discussion of what a Catholic notion of social justice is. And his particular example of applying social justice is actually to the idea of just wages, which is relevant to the conversation that some of us heard last night, Sora Bramari talking about Cardinal Manning and his intervention in the dock workers' strike in England in 1889. Social justice was a very, very common topic of Catholic philosophy and theology in the 1930s and the 1940s. You can find tons of master's theses and dissertations and little pamphlets about the idea of social justice. And for a variety of reasons, it kind of stopped after World War II. A combination of the Cold War, and maybe some of the sort of shifting focus after Vatican II. You just don't see as much Catholic theological and philosophical discussion of social justice. And so when it gets picked up in the later part of the 20th century and in our century, it does acquire a kind of meaning that seems more secular. And from an Aristotelian perspective, the idea of social justice sounds frankly redundant. Justice is already about relationships. It's already about order among parts and wholes. And so, like, what does social justice add to it? And in the Aristotelian tradition, there's already a classification of different kinds of justice. So justice isn't one thing, according to Aristotle. There's a sort of general justice, which is sometimes further specified as legal justice, which has to do with how all of the parts participate in seeking the common good together. And then there's particular justice, which has to do with how it is that parts are enjoying the goods of the community. And so particular justice can be further distinguished into distributive justice, how the goods and resources of society are allocated, and commutative justice, how it is that individuals are doing justice to each other, say, in fulfilling contracts and keeping promises. So in that framework, if you have commutative justice, and if you have distributive justice, and you have legal justice, why do we need social justice? What does it add to that? And furthermore, the way that many people talk about social justice, it seems as if it's a very crude notion of distributive justice. As if social justice is simply making sure that all the goods of society are properly shared, right? Material resources. And the most common invocation maybe of social justice, I think, in secular discourse is when people see that this group has more than its fair share, this group has been exploited and has been deprived of its fair share, so we just got to move some resources over here and call it even. That is a real kind of justice, by the way, distributive justice, but what do we get by calling it social justice, and is that what the Catholic tradition meant by social justice? There was a lively debate among Catholic thinkers about about how to classify social justice in this framework. Right? And basically there were three most common alternatives. Right? Some people wanted to say that social justice was a genuinely new kind of justice, a new virtue of justice over and above and in addition to legal, distributive, and commutative justice. That was probably the minority position, but there were some people who wanted to say that. More common was to associate social justice with legal justice. And there was a kind of divide between those who wanted to say that social justice is a new particular application and manifestation of legal justice that is distinctive in the modern age. So before the Industrial Revolution, we didn't need social justice because legal justice was enough, but something has changed in society, and so we need to develop a new notion of social justice as a particular application of legal justice. And then the last alternative was just to say social justice is just a new way to express what the tradition has always called legal justice. That debate, as far as I can tell, was never really settled. It just died out. You don't see that kind of conversation going on anymore. But it does seem to me that if you wanted to ask where is this notion of social justice in Aquinas, it would be in the idea of legal justice, where legal justice does not mean following the positive law of your local society, right? But submitting your activity to the order of the natural law. And the force of social justice, then, is not primarily on distributive justice, on how resources will be allocated. That is a part of it. But the force of social justice is that all people have a responsibility to do what they can to contribute to the goods of society. And that might mean noticing where other people are deprived of an opportunity to make that contribution and to support them. But it does put the obligation of social justice on individual people and not on a powerful entity, a policy, or a top-down structure. One of the things that I want to note about Sohrab Ahmari's reflections on Cardinal Manning is that when Cardinal Manning got involved in the dock workers' strike, right, his solution wasn't to go and petition Parliament to pass a new law for a minimum wage. Right? It wasn't a policy solution. He went and talked to the dock workers and learned from them about what their needs and wants were, and then he went and talked to the capitalists, the owners, who had an obligation to pay them, and learned about what their pressures were, and he worked with both of them, and he supported the strike as a means of action. But notice the strike is individual people deciding that they are going to work together to make their needs known, and then he, I don't know all the details as well as Sohrab does, right? But the story that he told was not a story of, okay, we need a new policy, we need a new law. Sometimes we do, and sometimes social justice does require revising laws. But if it's a structural evil in an economic system, right, that might be actually better solved by figuring out how people can better work together to find their common goods than simply stipulating in law this is what people should be paid. I'm not necessarily making a case against minimum wage efforts, but the tendency in our society when we see a structural evil is to want a top-down solution to it. Whereas it seems to me that in the Catholic and Thomistic tradition, when you see a structural evil, that puts a responsibility on every member of society, especially those who most see clearly what the structural evil is, to actively take a share in addressing that in their concrete individual actions. I think I've taken about 15 minutes, and I'll simply summarize. Right, I think it's important when we think about the conversations that arise about DEI and about the social problems that DEI is meant to address, that when we're drawing on religious intellectual traditions, that we be very open to the ways in which those intellectual traditions might not have the exact vocabulary that matches the secular discourse, but that we have to have hope and trust that it will offer the conceptual resources that we can make translations and shed light on what would otherwise seem as kind of intractable debates in secular discourse. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joshua. Jeff, please.
Thanks. That was really helpful to me. And thanks for inviting me to be on the panel. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. I struggled with whether or not to describe myself this way, but for the sake of transparency and truth-telling, I am and have been a diversity trainer for probably 20 years. And I have appreciated the deeply helpful comments and remarks that have been made and the spirit with which they've been delivered. I'm listening carefully. I'm mostly here to testify a little bit to my experience as a diversity trainer, but I don't know that I could call myself a DEI advocate. So there is some nuance there that's worth explaining. And diversity training is not my day-to-day job. I volunteer to do that for organizations. In particular, organizations that seem to evince a kind of love for a shared object or goal, which we talked about yesterday, Professor Greenaway talked about. When that is the case, I have seen remarkable results in diversity training. And when that's not the case, which I'll describe a little bit of that, it has been cataclysmic. Previously, I was in pastoral ministry at a statistically multi-ethnic church. The bar for that, meeting that statistical bar is it seems low for someone who's lived in LA now for 15 years. Multi-ethnic church is one in which no single racial or ethnic group comprises more than 80% of the congregation. And on last check, these numbers are from Baylor, it was 10% of mainline denominations qualify as multi-ethnic, 22% of evangelical congregations, 23% of Catholic congregations, 16% of Pentecostal. All of these are increases over the last 2 decades. So it was much less before that. But in terms of phenomena, the formation of these congregations, the increase is accounted for by the movement of people of color into predominantly white churches, and not the other way around. I have invested myself in diversity trainings for churches like these, and the church that we are most recently a part of. So I have tasted firsthand the lack of effectiveness that others have measured and that has been talked about from this panel or these panels. And so now I'm much more selective about where and when I deploy diversity training. One of the effects that I think I should describe is debriefing these workshops that I've both watched, delivered, and been a part of. Sometimes people become more skeptical of discussions around diversity, and some become entirely inoculated, some even becoming angered. So counterproductive indeed. And among the things that church and ministry leaders have wondered aloud to me, they have asked me, why can't we simply believe the best about others? Would that not incline us toward friendship instead of enmity? And I've been interested in that question, even as I understand it's been expressed by Thomas Aquinas in his section of the Summa on judgment. I am not an Aquinas scholar. I'm glad to be interacting with Joshua here and look forward to the conversation about this or learning more. Discerning friendship is a matter of judgment, and Aquinas seems to consider wrong judgments about someone's intentions, i.e. not believing the best, to be injurious. So when we are misjudged, our intentions and motives misjudged, we are injured by that. And so it seems to Aquinas better to assume the best and be wrong than to assume the worst. He writes of three different degrees of this misjudgment. The first degree is when a man begins to doubt of another's goodness from only slight indications. This he calls a venial and light sin. The second degree is when a man from slight indications esteems another man's wickedness as certain. This is a mortal sin, he says. And then the third degree is when a judge goes so far as to condemn a man on suspicion. This pertains directly to injustice and consequently is a mortal sin. He sums it up, I think, helpfully when he writes, unless we have evident indications of a person's wickedness, we ought to deem him good by interpreting for the best whatever is doubtful about him. This is one of the questions that I carry and with which I've preoccupied myself for some time in relation to DEI. Is it DEI that is unjustly orienting us to mistrust? If I may draw from the experiential quadrant of the Wesleyan quadrilateral, I need to state my personal difficulty in approaching this question. So even more difficult than saying that I'm a diversity trainer, I struggle with the strange timing of this conversation about friendship and enmity. This Monday, when I returned to Los Angeles, a criminal trial over the brutal murder of an Asian American woman in my congregation will commence. 5 years after the crime was committed. It has been the most difficult situation I've dealt with in pastoral ministry, and long story short, has resulted in the loss of all of my community that I once called beloved, a betrayal trauma about which I won't say anything further except that I'm still working through it, both therapeutically and theologically, all these years later. This crime took place just before a wave of violence against Asian Americans, and especially Asian American elders, was unleashed across the country during the COVID pandemic. Now, we could say that it's the fault of an identitarian imagination that made it so that I can't help but see my own aging parents in the faces of the Asian Americans brutalized that were thrown up on the nightly news. And it's out of that background that I approach this question, are we friends or enemies? Well, I want to be friends, and I'm nervous about it. And in these remarks, you'll hear me move back and forth between aspiration and anxiety. So I mentioned this community that I call beloved, and I want to start here with this idea that Martin Luther King adapted from Josiah Royce. For Royce, this was about a practically devoted love of an individual for community within individual religious experience. When King popularized it, he seems to mean something more phenomenological, which I'll describe momentarily. But for now, when beloved community is used in the DEI context, I find it to be almost beyond recognition. So a few university uses, the institutions will remain nameless. Here's one. A beloved community is defined by a commitment to work together to embody, reflect, and respect the complexities of all our parts. Another. Beloved community is working collaborative across differences to eradicate racism, all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice. And yet another. Beloved community is creating a community where everyone is cared for, absent of poverty, anger, and hate. All well and good. However, works and DEI departments and universities that treat beloved community as little more than inclusive and or diverse community miss the theological significance with which Royce and then King were using it. Beloved community is not merely a concept or an abstract aspiration. Civil rights historian Ralph Luker traced the development of King's use of the phrase. So in King's earliest uses of the phrase beloved community, he's referring to wins that took place in the Montgomery bus boycott. It seems more like a hope that emerges from a phenomenon than an abstract ideal. King was elated, quote, to find that divisions of religious denomination and social class were eroded and miracles of self-transformation occurred as ordinary people translated accumulated resentments from sullen acquiescence into determined courage. So there was an element of surprise at what King found during the bus boycotts, that people would join the cause and be persuaded to solidarity. I think that this is the kind of person-to-person transformation that you just talked about, Joshua, and also Professor Greenaway talked about so movingly yesterday. It's King's own surprise at ecumenical and interfaith cooperation and real personal moral transformation that would alter his understanding of his work. The beloved community is, of course, fueled by agape, which King understands as a kind of love which inclines one to be considered of the problems of others. And I suppose we could consider that to be a form of solidarity. Now, the tactical ethos of the community is nonviolence, about which King is explicit that one of the goals is to befriend. And I'm especially inspired by this concern about what he calls the violence of spirit. I think it speaks more to the question of presumption in Aquinas, and hence to DEI workers like myself, that injurious skepticism, unjustly believing the worst, is a dismal path. And yet, who is it that can deliver the imperatives of love for enemy or of nonviolence of spirit? I was speaking to a group of ministers, trying to impress upon them the importance of nonviolence of spirit and nonviolent methods. And one of them said back to me, "Who are you to tell us how to approach this?" So I asked the question, who is it that can deliver these imperatives of love for enemy? Whose job, for example, is forgiveness? Can I will myself to forgive? I know that forgiveness sets the sufferer free. I know all the psychic benefits of forgiveness, and yet it is not so easy to counsel this family of the victim that I will counsel when I return. It's not so easy to simply say that the command is to forgive. Rather, and I'll talk about this further on, forgiveness is a gift. Forgiveness is a gift that sets us free, given by a generous giver, even the Trinity. For now, I want to move back to an experience of suffering that generates skepticism that I think makes the kind of Kingian solidarity so difficult. So, drawing from the critical race studies, someone like Derek Bell, in his frequently cited article entitled Racial Realism, he critiques what he calls legal formalism And to define the term, he quotes another judge. Legal formalism is the use of deductive logic to derive the outcome of a case from premises accepted as authoritative. In other words, he's concerned about abstractions that are applied in ways that yield unequal outcomes, and especially detrimental outcomes for Black Americans. Other legal scholars write about this, that even when legal rights grant those with a grievance a highly individualistic remedy, the definition of those rights can be manipulated over time to legitimate the status quo. Now, as I'm reading Bell, I'm immediately struck by a very challenging prescription regarding a bleak outlook. He writes this, quote, "Black people will never gain full equality in this country. Even those Herculean efforts we hail as successful will produce no more than temporary peaks of progress, short-lived victories that slide into irrelevance. This is a hard-to-accept fact that all history verifies. We must acknowledge it and move on to adopt policies based on what I call racial realism. This mindset or philosophy requires us to acknowledge," and here's the phrase that sticks out to me, "the permanence of our subordinated status." He goes on to talk about the possibility for triumph that only becomes possible when there's an abandonment of the kind of despair that equality is some kind of promise to which we can attain. But it remains opaque to me what kind of triumph he might imagine if subordinated status is permanent. And in fact, John Powell, another legal scholar, both of them Christians, he says racial realism not only fails to address the real problem of racism, but it is also unsuccessful in avoiding despair. Indeed, it may not only add to our despair, but may also diminish our humanity. So he wants to rephrase Bell and say, we cannot know if we will achieve equality. And I think in that kind of uncertain, narrow, agnostic window, that's one in which I could possibly imagine friendship. And in fact, there's an ethics that attends the permanent subordinate status that I think makes friendship difficult, if not impossible. So that's bleak. And I think that kind of bleakness versus King's optimism is represented in a psalm like Psalm 39. And I'll just describe this briefly. Psalm 39 moves back and forth between despair and hope. It's a strange psalm at the end of Book 1 of the Psalter. Commentators are perplexed by this back and forth. Some think that it's referring to a person with a terminal illness. Some think it's referring to a wizened person at the end of their days. Some people would say that it's simply a strange dialogue of unnamed struggle. And in terms of the history of the reception of this psalm, Erasmus uses it to think about slander that comes from both Catholics and Reformers. Reformed Judaism has used it in funeral liturgy. The monastic tradition, for example, the Benedictines have used it in their rule of silence. Calvin and Luther recommend staying quiet when suffering persecution and oppression. My own speculation is to unify these oscillations in the psalm by seeing it as a single expression of moral injury that alienates the psalmist from those around him. Moral injury is initially used with veterans in the military, is described as a soul wound incurred when one's values are violated in a traumatic event. To me, this is not unlike the unctuous moral agency that Katie Cannon describes Zora Neale Hurston using. People-pleasing has been described as a kind of trauma response, and there's other ways to describe it, but the kind of ways that we interact can mask very much what's going on deep inside, hidden from plain sight. Here in Psalm 39, the psalmist maintains silence amid injustice. It leads to a kind of heartburn that perhaps you have experienced. I have. Verse 4, Lord, let me know my end and what is the measure of my days. Let me know how fleeting my life is. He's ready to contemplate the end. And then verse 7, oscillation. But now, Lord, what do I look for? My hope is in you. Save me from all my transgressions. And again in verse 12, hear my prayer, Lord, listen to my cry for help. But finally in the last verse, The psalmist flips the Aaronic blessing in despair. Instead of smile upon me, it's turn your gaze away from me so I can smile. I see in this psalm a single experience of moral injury that binds the oscillations together. And I think about, the kind of stress that's placed on communities of color that alters the expression of our DNA, and makes me to ask, again, are we friends or enemies? I'll conclude with this. I'm encouraged by third article theologians like Mike Habits and others who are putting forward that it's participation in the divine life, participation in the Holy Trinity, that the Holy Spirit is the source of our moral life, that to be partakers of the divine nature is the promise of the covenant, that God would be with us, and for now by the Holy Spirit, so that eschatologically our end is union with one another and with God. It's that kind of eschatological hope that I think is much different from a bleak perspective on permanent subordinate status, to which I'm still sympathetic, but long to be joined with all those who have longed for his appearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. George, please go ahead.
Is this working? Y'all hear? Is it not? I can project. Oh, they're recording? Okay. All right, this is better. Thanks for having me here. Even though it is October, it's still in the 90s in Texas, so we call it crematorium there for a reason. And so this weather is beautiful, wouldn't you say? I'm from Baylor. Go Bears, we actually won a football game. And I'm a professor, Christian. I'm gonna lean into the academic side of things, and I'm gonna do three things. I'm gonna discuss DEI and why it's not been working. I'm gonna discuss some of the foundations of DEI and identity politics. And I'm gonna discuss, I think, an alternative, a better approach. Now, I'm gonna discuss this from an academic point of view as a scholar. As a Christian, I actually believe that there's theological implications to this. With 15 minutes, I don't have time to go into that, but if someone wants to ask me a question about that, I'd be happy to talk about it. I'm with theologians here, so I'm a little bit nervous talking about discussing theology. I find a lot of theologians do a poor job understanding sociology. I do sociology, I go, what are you doing? So when I do theology, I get scared that they're thinking the same thing about me. So anyways, you said yes, yeah, that's probably true. So let's, DEI, or, what is DEI? I mean, it can mean a lot of different things. That's one of the things, there's no one set thing. But if you think about it as basically diversity types of efforts, then what does the research say? Well, here's what the research generally says, that diversity training long-term does not lessen prejudice. Just doesn't. Now there's some exceptions. I'm gonna go into why, when it does work, why it does work, but it does not lessen prejudice. You mentioned about a backlash. Research has documented there can be a backlash to DEI where people undergo training and come out even more hostile. Whites can undergo training, come out even more hostile to people of color. Teaching about privilege. What research has shown is teaching about privilege does not create more sympathy towards people of color. What it does do is create less sympathy towards marginalized white people. So whites who are homeless, who are substance abuse, people have less sympathy for them because they have privilege, so why are you homeless? When it comes to diversity training, mandatory diversity training, companies who do mandatory diversity training, 5 years later have fewer people of color working in manager positions. Companies that use set up grievance committees, 5 years later have fewer people of color in managers' positions. And so, the beat goes on. Diversity training, saying we're gonna do diversity training does not mean you're gonna actually do what you want to do, which I think is laudable. We want to create an environment where everyone can thrive. And that's what we want to do. But what we're seeing is the research is showing that this is not happening when we engage in diversity training. So obviously, doing that, we're not doing it in a way that's effective, in a way that works. So why is that? Well, I will suggest that part of what's happening here is that the way we do diversity training has emerged out of identity politics. Now, to understand that, and I don't have time to really go deep into it, but understand that identity politics, and by the way, I'll just put this caveat here, because I'm going to talk about it a little bit, quite a bit from the left. But recently, we've seen a lot of identity politics on the right as well. And so I'm not trying to say that this is just a leftist thing. But identity politics is based on the notion that we have our political agenda our political activism is tied to certain social identity groups, all right? It emerged as it became clearer to activists that Marxism as an organizing principle was not going to be very successful. Marxism, for whatever, whether you like it, hate it, whatever, one thing Marxism casts a vision of is creating a society that's going to enrich everyone. We have, the bourgeoisie we got to get out of the way, and they're, as conceptualized, as relatively few in number. Once we get them out of the way, then we create this sort of society where everyone benefits. All right, that's the ideal of Marxism. Identity politics is not about creating a society where everyone benefits. It's about our political activity is centered on helping certain groups. And that's where we put our energy towards. Now, when you do that, inevitably, you create a political activism that turns into these people are oppressed, these people are oppressors. And then that turns into a politics where we're concentrating on helping certain groups, even at the expense of other groups. I don't think it takes a lot of imagination to see how that has informed how we do diversity training. I recently read a book on courageous conversations. And throughout the book, it had this sort of format of here's the oppressed groups and here's what the oppressor groups need to do. That was the total format of this book. I think one of the reasons why diversity training has not been successful is that this format does not cast a vision where we come together. Cast a vision of here's the groups and here's the other group. Now, before anyone thinks, well, don't you think that there are differences in the groups? Yes, I do. And I do think that if solutions we're going to find are going to have differential responsibilities between, say, whites and non-whites. But if the original vision is, okay, here's the oppressor groups, and we're going to concentrate on that, that creates a situation where you're going to get backlash. That creates a situation like he describes where whites undergo diversity training and think, okay, I've done my duty, everything is solved. That makes these findings become more understandable when we see that they're located in identity politics that has not focused on globalized solutions, but solutions for particular groups. Given that, what could we do to create a better atmosphere, to really fulfill the goal, the purpose of what DEI promises? And let me suggest that in all the bad news on the studies, I did find some studies that showed when diverse training worked. A couple of things really jumped to mind. First, it worked when we concentrate more on skill development than teaching people what to, facts and awareness. If we help them to develop skills, that long-term helped them to actually work toward developing an atmosphere that was more accepting, that changed attitudes. Second, I think this is critically important. It worked when we help people to learn how to take the perspective of others. When we focus in on that, then diversity training tended to work. So teaching people, and by the way, everyone, on how to take perspective of others is very effective. Which leads me to a concept that I sort of have alighted upon, and there's other terms for it, but called collaborative conversations. And you define that by conversations where you build on the ideas of, goal-oriented conversations. So it's not talking about the weather. Goal-oriented conversations where you build on the ideas of others to find a solution. Because then you find solutions where everyone feels like they've had their say into the solution and they work together to bring it about. If we want DEI to produce friendships rather than create more enemies. We need to change the way we're doing it. We need to look at how we can facilitate better conversations to better problem solving, to teach people, because unfortunately we don't know how to do this any longer in a polarized society. I mean, this is the worst time to talk about this in a presidential year, of course. But we don't know how to talk to people in a way in which we're actually building consensus. We talk to people in polarizing ways, and we have us and them. We need to find out ways in which we can talk with each other and work together to find solutions. And if diversity, I'm convinced that if DEI starts doing this, then we're going to see a lot better outcomes. We're going to see a lot better long-term outcomes. Short-term is going to be painful, but I think we're going to see a lot better long-term outcomes in this way. And just look at the time, I'll just, because I want to leave this time for questions and such, I'll just end with this. One of the best ways to see on how this notion towards identity politics in my team and your team is, when you go on social media. Social media has been a boon in many ways, but also it's been a bane in how we learn how to talk to each other and how we quickly stereotype and demonize the other. And we try to persuade people. I hear people, right now everyone's trying to persuade people on who to vote for and stuff like that. I look at these persuasive efforts and I go, have you really thought that insulting people is not a good way of persuading people? Just a little advice there. But what the research shows about persuasion? There is research out there on how you persuade people. And here's what the research says. You persuade people by building rapport. You persuade people by understanding what they actually are saying. And part of collaborative conversations is actually, how do you listen well? Persuade people by agreeing when they are right. Persuade people by finding common ground. That's a collaborative conversation approach. That's what we've lost. That's what we're not doing. And I believe if we did that, we would see a lot more positive outcomes. And we would head towards the sort of building of friendships, building of community, rather than repolarizing our society. And with that, I'll leave it open for questions.
Thank you. I'll just begin with one question that I'm personally interested in, and it often gets, I think, overlooked in conversations about DEI, which understandably focus on the institutional level, focus on universities, structures, bureaucracies. And since you're from different parts of the country, different universities, different kinds of universities, you all work with students. So one question I have is, what do students think about DEI? Do students support DEI and some of the principles and practices? Are they just indifferent to it? Is it irrelevant to them? And I guess a related question is thinking about the demand side of the issue. So I think often when we think about intellectual genealogies of DEI, we think about how and why DEI came about. Is it an intellectual and ideological thing? Is it a legal thing? Is it a bureaucratic thing? Why did it arise on the kind of supply side? But what about the demand side? Why has it got traction specifically? Why is it that students and professors and academics, in many cases, seem to be supportive of it? What kind of needs or unmet needs is it filling? So what do students think about DEI in your experience or at your institutions? And more broadly, what about the demand side of the problem? Why is it that DEI specifically has got so much traction and seems to be connecting with so many students and academics?
I'll take the crack at the demand side of the program. Usually when I talk about DEI, I'm a race ethnicity class, and so people tend to support it, but that's not a representative sample. But for some reason around 2012, there was this dramatic uptick in the attention to issues of prejudice. There was an uptick in articles in research articles, in theses and dissertations, there's an uptick in media. And so if you did searches on racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever, there's this dramatic uptick. I don't know why the uptick happened. I'm curious, it is a question that, I know it happened. I don't know, I'm wondering why, but it happened. Since that, you also saw then an uptick in beliefs tied to identity politics. And I think that for whatever reason, why that uptick occurred, that's creating your demand side to there. I don't know. I guess I'll go ahead and say it. I was debating whether to say this or not, but I'm already in enough trouble, so. Yeah, I just had a paper come out about a year ago showing connection to identity politics and lower levels of well-being. And not surprisingly, or after 2012, if you look at the trends of well-being among the youth, it's dramatically decreased, especially with young women. Now, I'm not saying that it's just about this approach, this identity politics approach, because it could be other factors. I think Haidt talks about social media and devices, and I can't discount that completely. But I do think that, in addition to all this attention, I wonder what's behind these lower levels of well-being, because part of what is tied to that is sort of a catastrophizing, that everything's a catastrophe, and that's bad with well-being, but it's also would lead people towards the sort of DEI that we've seen, and so that's sort of where I'll stop at that.
I think it's hard to generalize about students because I think there's a lot of different experiences about DEI and a lot of different attitudes or expectations about it. One thing that I think motivates some students to be attracted to DEI or the whole universe of reflection on race, identity, critical race theory, all those kinds of things, is a very basic and understandable hunger for meaning. I mean, we all want a meta-narrative, and in a secular world where the meta-narrative of a religious story is not the one that's most plausibly offered, something else is going to rise to the top. And a story that tells you that if you notice injustice in the world, or you feel somewhat alienated, a story that gives names to that and tells you whose fault it is and what you should do about it is going to find people who you don't have to reflect too deeply on what the story is. It's just a compelling story already. So I think that's some of it. Some students also then learn to react to it or digest it through signals on social media, and so some of them think of it as an ideological thing, and they'll like it more or they'll like it less, or so then they get drawn into the kind of polarization of American political discourse. I think a lot of students don't think about it very much. I mean, I think primarily in a university it's a managerial phenomenon, and so employees notice it more than students. What students might notice is that there are conversations about diversifying the curriculum or having more representation on the faculty or something like that. But those are they're not thinking about DEI, they're thinking about very concrete things. I'm sure it varies on different campuses, but I think on a lot of campuses, there are some faculty who are very eager to see DEI efforts implemented, but there's, in my experience, almost always a quiet, tolerant majority that views DEI efforts cynically as an administrator's insurance policy, so that a president or a vice president can say, well, look, I did this, right? Functionally, honestly, DEI is often a way to avoid what I was describing as actual social justice. If you were in charge of an organization and you thought that there was racial tension or racial division or some historic injustice that needed to be corrected on campus, you wouldn't set up an office and appoint a bunch of new administrators to issue policy statements about that. You would talk to people And you would be on the ground, and you would be visiting people in their offices, and you would be trying to get people to work together. That's hard work, and it's much easier to follow the playbook. And there literally is a playbook about how college presidents can set up these offices, and there's a whole industry to train the people who staff these offices, and they, universities often hire people from outside to come and tell a community that they know nothing about what the common good of that community is, and so no wonder faculty are often cynical about it, but they keep their mouths shut usually. That's my experience. Yeah.
Thank you.
I would only add that just the question about do students even know about DEI. I don't know how many congregations know about Black theology or liberation theology. It can be a phenomenon, a managerial phenomenon. I have not encountered a bunch of students that are involved in DEI discourse, but I'll give you an example. I was briefly the chaplain for a consortium of not Christian colleges. I was a chaplain for a consortium of colleges in Southern California, and our department was the interfaith chaplains, Black student affairs, and Chicano Latino student affairs. So essentially an identitarian office, right? And that's how we were perceived on campus. That's how students accessed student services. It was by identity. So the managerial phenomenon is shaping and forming the life of students. And that's also true for demands on syllabi and the hiring of faculty. It has a formational impact on the lives of students. And I would agree that the search for identity is what's driving the demand. I mean, when the CDC reports that 57% of high school Asian Americans have experienced some form of racism in their time there, there is a gravitational pull towards that experience of subordination that binds folks together. And for whatever that's worth, that desire for a shared identity, even in suffering, is commodifiable.
Thank you. Well, yeah, we have about 15 minutes for questions, so I'd like to open things up to the audience. Please. Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you all so much. Professor Yancey, I have to say, we implemented I'm at Providence College. I work on mission integration around DEI. And with my DEI colleagues, we implemented some of the strategies that you spoke about, such as skills acquisition, contemplative, or voice practices, things of that. And we saw a 12% increase in students identifying as though they belong and understand their responsibility in creating belonging spaces. So we're seeing those efforts in those ways actually already giving data to say that it's working better than the traditional DEI trainings that were done at the same time, same orientation time slot 3 years prior.
To write it up, make it an art.
Yeah, my administration side, I'm not used to writing the data post. But my question actually is for Professor Hochschild. You spoke about that individual responsibility. My experience is that friendship requires proximity. We see Jesus eating at the table, it's knowing. And a lot of DEI efforts are aimed at proximity of diverse voices to decision making. And they're aimed at that because for a long time that proximity didn't happen. Individuals were not inviting those to the table with diverse voices. And so my question is, when individuals do not take up the responsibility of friendship or even the responsibility of justice, then at what levels, what's the next step then?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think that is a responsibility. I guess I'm not sure that we have a disagreement or that I have an alternative strategy to addressing it. I guess what I would emphasize is that is something that is best addressed by the people who are in those situations, and they need to be given the ability to make those efforts to form those friendships or to reach out to those communities that they need to be in touch with. And that it's not, even that wouldn't be ideally top down. It wouldn't be a policy that just says, we're gonna have a rule that there has to be this representation. But there's gonna be, if you're an administrator in that situation, right, it would be much better to form friendships with the people that you want to have more representation on their committee and talk to them individually about why they need more representation on their committee, rather than having what feels like a kind of arbitrary and identitarian rule. It's a subtle difference, and maybe the way to form those friendships is to start with a kind of policy. Partly what I'm advocating is not necessarily a different strategy, but a different framing, right? And I think that sometimes administrators don't see policies as part of forming relationships. They see them as an alternative to forming relationships. And that's why I said a lot of people experience a DEI initiative on campus or a DEI office on a campus as an administrator's insurance. I got that out of the way. Now someone else can worry about it. And if someone complains that things aren't good on my campus, I can say, well, I followed best practices, right? We hired the consultants and they told us to do this. And that's an evasion of responsibility, right? So if I were giving advice to an administrator, I would say, well, I mean, go ahead, if you want to set up a DEI office, that's fine, but then you should take an active interest in what it does, and you should take responsibility for whether they are actually forming relationships on campus. And if you find what George has described, that yours is just the latest DEI office to actually make things worse on your campus, then you have to own that too, right? I would love to hear more from you about how on a Catholic college campus you can achieve a more effective DEI initiative by focusing on integration with the institution's mission that pre-existed that. I've been advocating that on my campus for 10 years. I have receipts about how I've told people at my campus, right? DEI will fail unless you connect it to our Catholic mission. And it has failed. We have some of the same results that George has researched, right? Because so far it has not been integrated with our Catholic mission. And so I would love to learn from you about how it can actually be integrated into a community's sense of what it means to join a community. Yep.
I'm mindful of the time, and I think that was specifically for Joshua. So, Michael, do you have a question?
Yeah, I think it's in his book Reaching Out, where Henri Nouwen talks about hospitality as the space where the stranger can become the friend instead of the enemy. And I wonder if you might talk a bit about, any of the three of you, about how the Christian hospitality tradition might be a resource for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I don't have a full answer to that, but I'll just say briefly that one of the things that I've often repeated on my campus, we're a Catholic campus with a Marian shrine, a national shrine to Our Lady of Lourdes. The dynamics on my campus are that some of the people who are most concerned about formal DEI initiatives are least connected to our Catholic identity. But the irony is that the most diverse part of campus is always the shrine. I can walk around the Lourdes Grotto, which is like a beautiful garden, and it almost feels otherworldly. And not hear English spoken. I mean, I feel like the minority up there, because there's all kinds of little national shrines. There's a Filipino, and there's the Vietnamese, and there's what attracts diverse people to Mount St. Mary's? Mary, right? Her welcoming arms, making them feel hospitable. There's something just about her person that's more hospitable. I'm sorry. Than a typical DEI office, which is not it's a pretty chilly place. Like, I walk by it and it like the temperature drops, it's just not a hospitable tone, right?
Jeff or George, anything to add on hospitality?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the Good Samaritan And the question is, who is my neighbor? The answer is, who was a neighbor? So there is, taken out of context, there's an injunction to be a neighbor. But placed back into cultural context, Jesus doesn't say that out of nowhere. It's coming from a plausibility structure in which there are hospitality codes. So, I want to think simultaneously about personal responsibility for hospitality, but also building in structures that express hospitality as a matter of course. And I think there's ways to do that. You could call them DEI, but I just, I think it's yearning for a culture in which this is the heart of what we do, and that's difficult. So when we talk about the Christian tradition of hospitality, I mean, I lived in the Midwest for a long time. It was casseroles and potlucks. That was part of it, but I think it's different in so many different places, but it's not always built in as thickly. And I think longing to welcome folks who have thick practices of hospitality wherever we experience thinness of hospitality or thinness of friendship, I think that's got to be part of the solution.
Okay, we're going to do 2 more questions.
I realize we have a lot of representation from confessional institutions here. My question has a little bit more to do with secular pluralistic universities, and in particular the relationship between the academic side of the institution and student affairs. So pluralistic universities largely kind of gave up on trying to inculcate, very specific visions of the good as institutions quite a while ago. And yet, most faculty members still had, fairly strong commitments to truth as such, and there's all kinds of self-correcting mechanisms like peer review to keep folks honest. Now, I was a chaplain at Cornell for 20 years, and one of the changes I observed that I think was significant is that student affairs used to report up through the dean of students, which was a member of the faculty, and it was a rotating post, right? So student affairs was subordinate to the faculty. And then at some point, they just kind of acknowledged an emerging reality, I think, that student affairs is its own thing, right? And they kind of broke it out, it's separate, and now they hire a professional student affairs person who comes in from the outside, has no connection to the faculty. And student life is really shaped largely by student affairs, as much or more than by the classroom and by the faculty. And this seems to me a kind of watershed change, because most of the folks in student affairs don't have PhDs, they're not part of the academic culture, right? Their ideas don't have to go through peer review. And whereas faculty members, I think, are willing to see the institution as being kind of agnostic on substantive notions of the good, on the student affairs side, it seems like there's a kind of grappling to try to articulate, well, this is the vision of the good that we're really after. We want to inculcate these morals in our students, right? And so moral formation has in a sense been delegated to student affairs. And I just wonder if you can help me think this through. What are the implications of this? Is this diagnosis that I observe sort of close to correct? And what are the problems with this? That it seems to me secular pluralistic universities are having trouble remaining agnostic with respect to visions of the good. And that debate is unfolding not on the academic side of the university, but on the student affairs side of the university.
I'm going to say yes and no as far as your diagnostic. I think you are overestimating the degree to which academics are trying to have an agnostic approach. But I think you're correct in that it's not as much towards students, it's more in what's published. Like, there's a ton of stuff out there on research on the fears of conservatives and almost nothing on the fears of progressives. So when we look at the research, I can't go with you, and I've studied about the biases of academics. But I do think that the layer of student affairs, which interacts with the students, has more of an impact on the students. And I remember seeing a paper once showing that when it comes to, say, stifling free speech, that it's more about the bureaucracy than the professors. So I do think, I don't have the confidence you do that the academics are trying to be agnostic, but to be honest, a lot of academics, where their activism is more in the academic realm and not with their students as much. That's where the student affairs comes in. I do think it's more of a problem of stifling our ability to have these kind of conversations due to student affairs.
Let's wrap up with a question from RJ.
Joshua, you made reference to the new encyclical. I haven't read it, so I have no opinion about it, and am using the sections that you referred to in 183 just as an occasion for a question, so not about the encyclical. In 182, the Holy Father makes reference to a civilization of love. In 183, we get structures of sin. But then in 183, when he's articulating what we're hoping for, it's the conversion of the heart. In 184, he cautions against external actions and refers to the mystique, which seems to be about interiority or grace. So we tend to have pretty well-developed categories of conversion of the heart, right? These are rooted in the invisible missions of the Holy Spirit, which gives to us the invisible mission of the Word. We have sanctifying grace, actual grace, habitual grace. That's all very well-developed. If we're going to accept, as I think you do, and I think correctly, that there are social structures of sin and there is social justice, do we need to have an account, and does the tradition allow us to have an account of social grace? Not grace which changes my heart so that I act differently, grace which changes my heart so I can act collectively differently. Does the tradition allow, based in the visible mission of the Word, a category of social grace which seems to be a needed correlate to social structures of sin and social justice?
That's a great question. I'll give a very short answer that comes immediately to mind. The church is social grace. Right? Individuals have grace thanks to their membership in the church, and that's the Holy Spirit that animates the church. I don't think that's a full answer to your question. But I think it might be, and I haven't read the whole encyclical closely. I read enough to get those useful quotations. It's a very different encyclical than anything Francis has written before, or published before, authorized before. He's written mostly about social stuff, right? And so some people, their original reaction was, wow, this is very different, this is very interior, this is more devotional, and that reaction plays into a tendency among, I think, modern Catholics to contrast the social, the outward, with the interior, right? And to assume that one or the other is the more authentically way to live out the Christian mission. I have a hunch. It'll be my reading hypothesis as I read the encyclical more closely that he's not trying to reinforce that dichotomy, but to bridge it and to show us how it can only be by understanding the outward in relation with the inward that we can understand either of them at all. Right? The very title of the encyclical, Dilexit Nos, He loves us. Right? So it's about the heart of Jesus, but it's about how our relationship to the heart changes us as a we, right? The church. So again, I don't think I'm not directly answering your question, but I think I'm open to the suggestion that if there is structural evil or systemic evil, there are ways in which we can receive grace from not directly from some one individual source, but from a community. Communities can impart grace. I believe that, yeah.
Thank you. We will regroup for the next panel at 11, but please join me in thanking our panelists.